Thank you all again for joining us here today. My name is Dr. Megan McGinley-Arnone, and I'm the Director of Education and Grants Management here at Sag Harbor Cinema. As our Executive Director, Genevieve Villaflor, mentioned in the theater, this is our second edition of our Lighthouse series, our ongoing mental health initiative that pairs film with mental health topics. So it's really heartwarming to have you all here on this gorgeous summer day to discuss a difficult topic, the manifestations of addiction and hopefully recovery, with Ryan Fleck's film Half Nelson as an entry point for discussion. A very special thank you to the Florin Smith family for sponsoring the Lighthouse project, Bill Collage, Dr. Diana Diamond, Susan Mead, the Education Committee at Sag Harbor Cinema, and the Sag Harbor Cinema Board for their support of this project, and to the staff of Sag Harbor Cinema for all of their support as always. I'd also like to thank the organizations that have dedicated their time and materials for this event: Generation SOS, OLA's Youth Connect, and Northwell Health. Before we get started, I'd like to formally introduce our moderator and our panelist. First, our esteemed moderator, Minerva Perez. Minerva is OLA of Eastern Long Island's executive director and serves on the board of Sag Harbor Cinema. Before starting at OLA in 2016, she was the director of residential transitional services for 6 years at The Retreat, where she ran a 24-hour crisis shelter for women and children fleeing domestic abuse. Minerva was honored in 2024 as a champion of diversity by Suffolk County legislator Ann Welker, was nationally recognized in 2019 as an NBC Latino 20 honoree for her leadership of OLA and its impact in our region, and was named Sag Harbor Person of the Year in 2018. Under Minerva's leadership, OLA has greatly expanded its programs, services, and advocacy. Most recently, she conceptualized and oversaw the establishment in 2013 of the organization's Immigration Legal Services, and in 2022 of Youth Connect, an adolescent mental health support program. Thank you, Minerva, for moderating this panel. Next on our panel, we have the esteemed Dr. Jeffrey Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds is the president and CEO of Family and Children's Association, one of Long Island's largest and oldest health and human service organizations, serving over 35,000 individuals each year. Under his leadership, FCA has expanded vital services for clients aged 2 to 102, including addiction prevention, treatment, and recovery programs. Since joining FCA, Dr. Reynolds has secured over $18 million in new funding and launched major initiatives such as the Thrive Recovery Centers and a certified recovery peer advocate program. A lifelong Long Islander and a 2-time cancer survivor, he leads a team of more than 360 staff and 200 volunteers with compassion, drive, and deep commitment to community care. Welcome, Dr. Reynolds. And our esteemed panelist, Dr. Jaclene Jason, is a clinical psychologist and senior director of behavioral health and addiction services at Northwell Health's South Oaks Hospital. She is also an assistant professor at the Donald and Barbara Zucker School of Medicine at Hofstra Northwell. Her work focuses on helping individuals overcome struggles with mental health, including psychosis, anxiety, depression, and substance misuse. Her approach emphasizes a holistic perspective on healing, helping individuals actualize a meaningful life based on their personal values. She has also worked with adolescents and adults who have behavioral issues and legal involvement. Thank you so much. I'll hand it over to Minerva to start the panel.
Good afternoon, everyone. Really wonderful to be sitting here with you both. Thank you for being here. Thank you. And thank you all for being here as well. Not all of you have seen the film, or maybe you've seen it in the past. It is certainly a pretty intense film, a pretty honest film. And we chose it because it's a great film and also because it has this a focus both on the sort of the adult experience and also and a youth perspective as well. So we wanted to bring that both together because this conversation is not, even though Ola has, and we have Anastasia Goknauer, she's our director of our program for Youth Connect, even though a lot of work we do with adolescent, we wanted to make sure that this conversation was a fuller conversation that included all ages and all socioeconomic backgrounds, all sort of conversations around this topic. So I want to start off by actually asking each of the panelists kind of what really stood out to you in this moment, given the work that you've been doing throughout your careers. What really stood out in this moment about a film that was done, was it 2006? Yeah. So I'll actually start with you, Dr. Jason.
Sure. I think one thing that is important that the film highlights and that we see a lot in the work of behavioral health, specifically around addiction, is just the interconnectedness of different people's experiences and their lives. And I think the film does a really nice job of showing the diversity of experience that comes along with substance use and getting rid of some of the stigma around it by understanding how it can be more of a process that lends itself into becoming problematic, as opposed to people either have addiction or they don't, or it's not going to touch me or it is going to touch me.
Okay, thank you.
So for me, there was one particular line that stood out, and it was a great opportunity to do some education, and I kind of felt like they missed it. A young woman asked Ryan Gosling what it's like when you smoke that stuff. And I waited for his answer to be, I feel normal and I feel at peace. Because so many young people are struggling with that these days, where it's not necessarily, I feel buzzed, I feel high, I feel crazy, I feel looser. It's, I finally, for once in my life, feel normal. And when we begin to connect the issues of mental health with substance use disorders and why kids wind up using substances, that's front and center. We often talk about, I think about the scene with the white family drinking excessive amounts of wine, and we always talk about that there are quote unquote gateway drugs for young people. And these days we think about tobacco, vaping, cannabis, alcohol. Biggest gateway in the world is an untreated mental health condition that is treated with a substance that's more accessible than mental health treatment can be, and sometimes cheaper, quite frankly. And so for me, that was like the golden moment, in addition to that interconnectedness and some of the disparities when it comes to race and how we view substance use disorders. That stood out for me, and I was hoping he was going to say, I just hung on the words. I'm hoping he says, I just feel normal.
Thank you. Thank you. I since you just brought it up as well, I kind of wanted to speak about that line that connects mental health and coping sometimes. As you said, sometimes it can be cheaper than what we have access to in terms of mental health support. Some of the work that we do with adolescents, we want to be there to have a conversation kind of like this in appropriate terms with youth. I know I was speaking with Dr. Reynolds a couple seconds before we started, is the challenge that we find. We have funds that we've got through the opioid settlement, funds that came through, and yet we find it very, very difficult for institutions or adults to let us have these meaningful conversations in appropriate ways with kids that are the same age as the ones that were in this movie. So 13-year-olds, middle school. We have a very hard time even starting to broach a conversation around not just substance, but kind of like, what do you do that allows you to cope? And is that coping mechanism something that is feeding you and you feel proud of? Is it taking you off your game? Is it making you feel more depressed? Is it making you feel, do you hide it when someone walks in the door, whatever your coping is? I mean, like terms that we can really talk about. How do we cope with the difficulties that we have in life? We can't get institutions to really understand the importance of having those conversations. And so, Dr. Reynolds, I know that you've been battling this for about 30 years. So what are some of the ways that you've seen either that work, or what are you still trying?
So I think some of the districts have started to think about mental health, and I know Northwell has actually done some clinic placements with school districts. There's still a reluctance, though, to talk about substance use. And I've done literally hundreds of parent universities with parents at night in which like 5 parents show up. They're generally not the parents who need to be there, quite frankly. And I think one of the key things, particularly in districts that have a high percentage of high net worth individuals, mom and dad are off doing their thing, and it's very hard for them to say, do as I say, not as I do. And so if mom needs to drink 2 bottles of wine and a Xanax in order to get on a plane, it's very hard to say to your 13-year-old that is coping with everything that 13-year-olds have to cope with, don't smoke weed, don't drink, that kind of thing. And so I think the key is getting to the parents and the kids simultaneously in tandem. Districts historically have been reluctant to do that. And lots of districts that we've gone to in the past have said, well, you should probably be spending more time in those other districts. We don't have that as a problem here, when in fact we do. And just to contextualize it for 30 seconds, we're still in the middle of a fentanyl crisis. And although there's recent news saying fatalities have dropped, they're not at zero. Those are all preventable fatalities. Last year, there were 30,000 fewer people who died of an overdose, which to those families, or poisoning, which to those families means, everything, right? There's fewer fatalities, fewer deaths, fewer community disorganization. But 80,000 Americans still died from something that's preventable. And whatever gains we made were not even in terms of the gains. And so in Black and brown communities, the fatalities continued to increase. Yet we all kind of celebrated and said, oh, good, there's a drop in the numbers. When we talk about young people, the fatalities haven't dropped. And it used to be that young people could experiment in a way that wasn't immediately harmful to them. It might be over the long term, given everything we know about brain development. But in a day and age of fentanyl, the DEA uses a slogan. I'm not a fan of the DEA all the time, but it's one pill can kill. And for young people, that's a reality. I wish districts took this more seriously. I do think, we went through a period of time where parents who had lost kids to fentanyl poisonings and overdoses, and those are 2 different things. We're going back to school districts and saying, my kid went to your school and my kid died, and I'm not putting the responsibility on you, but you should have done more and you should be doing more. And so whenever that happens, or there's an interested parent on the PTA, we begin to see some action. But it's like pulling teeth to get them to school districts to offer free, right, funded through another source, programs to educate kids about mental health conditions and substance use disorder.
Like you mentioned, Northwell does do a lot of work in the school districts to build that awareness around substance use and mental health. We have different relationships, whether it's partnerships or contracts with districts so that they get easy, quick access to psychiatry and linkage to care. I agree with your sentiment around sometimes there is more of an open door to discuss mental health than substance use. Our framework really is to help reduce some of those barriers. So, some of the programs that I'm a part of, for example, we have a mental health program for adolescents and we have a substance use program for adolescents, which are separate programs, and not all programs function like that. There's pros and cons. One of the pros is that our clinicians are cross-trained to be able to help support if substance use needs to be addressed as a primary or a secondary issue, or the mental health piece. What we see a lot is that it's very dependent on where the family is willing to identify as the avenue in. So, for example, we've worked with 2 adolescents that on paper and speaking to them might have the same issues, amount of use, anxieties, depression, situations on paper, and one family and an adolescent be very readily open to substance use treatment, saying, I just got to get this under control and then I can manage the rest of my life. And the other adolescent and family saying, once I get the anxiety and depression under control, then I can target the substance use. And for us in the mental health field, we don't really, it's not as big of an issue where we're starting, as long as we're identifying what is the contributing factor that are going on that make this almost, a circular pattern. And how are we, to your point, identifying what would be healthy, helpful coping skills so that we could help the individual move towards living that successful life. And when we frame it like that, it takes some of the responsibility away of us having to really figure this out to know what the best avenue is, because our goal is that any avenue is the right avenue, because we have staff to receive you that understand how to work through those issues. I think the other piece is that research is such an important component. So we're not just saying that education is important because we think education is important, and we have this misconception across the board. So I'll give another example. We surveyed a number of healthcare professionals that are non-mental health professionals and asked them specific questions around suicide identification and questions. And a majority of healthcare workers that are not behaviorally trained had this misconception that asking and talking about suicide actually could plant a seed or increase it. And we see the same false belief system around substance use, that by talking to a 13-year-old about substance use or suicide, that we're actually giving them information that could lead them towards a path of being more likely, when we know statistically that it reduces it because it opens the door for a conversation and they're informed.
Just another point on that. I think for a long time, and you don't think of this as happening in modern history, but it still happens, the folks that do drug education tend to exaggerate the potential impact of drugs on the human body, right? And so if you go into a group of 16-year-olds and say, if you use cannabis today, you're going to have a needle in your arm tomorrow, you're going to wind up homeless, your world is going to fall apart. Kids know we're lying, right? Kids know that happens to some people sometimes. But generally, that's not the trajectory for adolescents who experiment or use cannabis or other drugs. So I think to the extent that we can harken back on the science, the reality is for kids under the age of 25 whose brains are still developing, you don't have to exaggerate the potential impact and the potential downsides. They're there. Tell them the truth. And I think when we talk about, to get back to the gateway issue, when we talk about cannabis as a gateway drug, it suggests that the only way cannabis becomes a problem is if you go on to use other drugs. It's a problem for the developing brain, period. That doesn't mean you're going to lose 100 IQ points overnight, but it does mean that chronic regular use has an impact. And I think it's finding some of those nuances and being honest with kids and parents about the potential impact of substances on your body and putting that in a more holistic framework of overall health and well-being is the way to go. Most districts will call us and say, look, it's Red Ribbon Week, we do drug awareness. Can you come in for 45 minutes to a group of 400 kids and talk to them about drugs? I can do that. I'll go in an auditorium, I'll scare them, that kind of thing. You know what that accomplishes? Nothing. Because as scary as it can be, and I can see the looks in their eyes, it's gone by the time they get on the bus. Because that kind of stuff doesn't work. It's the more sustained, thoughtful, honest, nuanced discussions that are interactive, not just me yelling into a microphone, that actually move us forward. And I wish there were more space and time in the school day to prioritize those types of things and those kind of conversations.
Can I just add one more thing about the school district piece and also the family piece? When we're talking about, like you're mentioning, going in and having this conversation that builds the education, another thing that I think we're balancing, like you mentioned, this comfort in talking about things, is we also see, especially in adolescence, a lot of independent research, I'll call it.
That's a kind of
so we kind of see these two polarities of individuals. One of nothing's wrong with me, I'm fine, I don't want to talk about it. And the other of like, this is my diagnosis, I am a patient and you need to help me and I can't be faced with any stressors in my life. And both are problematic. So the other education that we're doing a lot in the schools is that if we're saying that there's this behavioral health concern, substance use, mental health, we're not saying that the individual should be void of responsibilities or stressors. We're saying that we need to give them the resources to manage them. So, you know, schools sometimes do an amazing job of building these calming rooms or coping rooms or like whatever they call them. They're individually named per school. And some schools do an amazing job of like, this is a temporary thing for certain amounts of time, re-regulate, go back to what you need to do. And other schools really can use it as like fueling of avoidance, which can lead to longer problems down the road. The goal isn't that you say I'm anxious and you never have to go back to the problem. That can completely can be contributory. So we are constantly also educating on this balance of you can identify and talk about your struggles and your behavioral health diagnoses and maybe the disease of addiction or any mental health. And there's things that we can empower you to do to move through it successfully, knowing where your limitations are. And that doesn't mean that you're not capable of handling any of this stress.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an ongoing struggle to have that conversation. And we are able to go into schools. So we go into middle schools and high schools, but there's still some middle schools across the east end of Long Island that prohibit us from having certain conversations. And I'm talking very low level conversations around that just touch on substance or how you cope and how you know, because the answer that you get is much like in the film, I'm good, I've got this, I know what I'm doing, I'm all right. And a 14-year-old will tell you that they're all right. The other thing we get a lot from our helpline is our youth not wanting to share what they're going through with their parents because they don't think their parents can handle it. They just don't think that they have the capacity to handle the pain that they're in. And that's a really sad situation. So I wanted to, there was something else coming up to me. Actually here, because I don't want to focus only on youth, but I'm glad we talked a bit about it, but is for the person in our lives that we might be having in our lives right now, whether they be an adolescent or an uncle or a spouse or a friend. You watch sort of the evolution of Ryan Gosling's character, and you wonder always, what can I do? How can I help? What can I do? What should I not do? Are there some answers that you might give, regardless of whether it's an adolescent or an adult? Maybe they're different answers, but let's say in this case, it's an adult in your life. Dr. Reynolds?
I think the most important thing is to say something. And so often folks will be heading down this road. I see it both in families. I see it with people on our staff who struggle. I see it with our clients where this will go on for an extended period of time. Someone will eventually call them out, or they'll have something that kind of sweeps them into the system, a DUI arrest, some violent incident, they'll lose their job, something will happen, and the light bulb will go off, and they'll say, why didn't anybody ever say anything to me? And so very often we tiptoe around that impaired person. We might even joke along with them at the family barbecue after they've had 7 or 8 beers. And then behind their back, like, can you believe he drank 7 beers? He does this every time. What's the deal kind of thing. We owe it to people to have those conversations. The same way if you had someone who is aging and perhaps wouldn't be able to drive a car anymore or is forgetting things, you would tap on the shoulder gently and with love and compassion and say, hey, do you think there's something going on? This is what I noticed. Is something going on? And so all that tiptoeing, all that joking around, all that kind of side chatter gets in the way of that person's recovery. We at FCA, we have a commitment, we affirmatively hire folks in long-term recovery. And so probably 95% of the staff in our 3 recovery centers are people who are in long-term recovery. They've walked the road and they can say that to another person and say, I've been exactly where you were. Same thing in our treatment centers, although there the balance of professionals versus peers looks a little bit different. But the folks who walk through the doors of our recovery centers, the closest one being in Riverhead, will testify to the miracle of recovery and the world that lies on the other side of all of that, and helping folks to get there, both in terms of having the conversation, along with providing the concrete means to do it. And look, there are lots of pathways to recovery. Sometimes those include harm reduction until the person has found that path to recovery. Sometimes that includes this 12-step program. Sometimes it's formalized treatment. Sometimes it's medication-assisted treatment. We've got to embrace all pathways, but it starts almost all the time with a single conversation. And as we have those conversations, we know that for a lot of people, substance use disorders are a potentially fatal condition in a lot of folks, way too often. But we can interrupt that pattern, and finding the way to do that in a way that's, again, compassionate, but also forthright is critical, I think.
I think the example of almost the role play that you just laid out is very helpful of this is how we frame that conversation. we want to have the conversation with curiosity. So if we don't come through it from a curious place, it can feel more accusatory. And if we're accusatory, then it puts the other person on the defense, as opposed to how Dr. Reynolds laid it out, which is what we're observing and then asking a question. It's our observation, it's tangible, it's objective, and we're opening up the conversation of, is there something going on? This is what I'm seeing. And it just opens the door for more of a conversation. What we see happen when we don't come through it with curiosity is, this is just like a example if you could picture. So if I'm having a conversation with anyone in this room and we're looking at this piece of art and you're telling me you appreciate the teal over there, and I'm like, that's red. And now we're spending an hour of me convincing you this is red. You don't want to talk to me about it anymore. You're like, you're never going to understand. This is clearly teal and I'm not talking about this anymore. We see kind of the same thing happen with substance use or mental health, where we might say, no, you absolutely have a problem. Something is going on and this is what you need to do about it. Or you need to do this. Trust me, you need to do this. And it invalidates kind of the experience and also closes a door, because now you put the other person in the position to explain to you why they don't need to do that and why you're wrong, as opposed to if you come about it with curiosity, what makes you see it that way? Tell me about the experience. What happened on Monday versus Tuesday, because this is what I noticed of the difference that I saw in you Monday versus Tuesday. Now we're just gathering information together and we're more aligned in where we're at and where we both collectively think makes sense to go.
So I think it's also important to recognize that not everybody is ready for treatment on our timeline. And so at FCA, we're really clear about saying to folks, here are your options. So we have a group of folks, all who have experienced overdoses themselves and been Narcaned, usually several times, that report to hospitals following an overdose and work with patients. The uptick rate for treatment looks dramatically different when our folks go and have the conversation versus when a busy emergency room doctor, nurse, PA has the conversation, because there's more time, there's a little bit more thoughtfulness. And in all of those cases, it's like, okay, you almost just died. Would you like to go to treatment? Sometimes the answer is, yeah, I guess I better. But more often than not, it's like, I'm not sure I'm ready to go. Cool. How can we keep you alive tonight? We don't want you to die tonight. We know that when someone suffers an overdose, they're exponentially higher risk for a subsequent overdose. So how can we keep you alive? How can we get you somewhere safe? If it's not to a treatment facility, is it to a shelter? Can I give you fentanyl test strips so that you can test the drugs before you use them? Can I give you a naloxone kit? Can I talk to you about not using by yourself anymore, so that if something happens to you, there's someone there to help you? We find those incremental steps along the way, which feel counterintuitive to folks who subscribe to the old model of doing things. It's either you're ready to go to treatment or you're not. You're just not ready. Well, we said that to people for a lot of years, and a lot of people died unnecessary deaths. And so now I think it's a more open-minded approach to say, look, you've got to be ready to do this. And there are ways we can increase your readiness to do that. Law enforcement does that really well. But in the meantime, how do we keep you alive? How do we give you the basics? And as you begin to take control over your own life, when you use, how you use, and how you protect yourself, we build your efficacy. As we build your efficacy, guess what? The self-esteem begins to lift. If you notice, Ryan Gosling's demeanor throughout the film just sunk lower and lower and lower. It's that, self-disappointment, it's the shame, it's the embarrassment, it's all of that. And how do we build you back up to take control over your health? And sometimes that's more important than treatment in the moment.
Yeah, I did want to actually, one of my questions was sometimes the debate around harm reduction versus old school, which is don't do drugs, just don't do them. But having these conversations, it's really wonderful to hear you talk about the different way to build that efficacy and confidence potentially in maybe being able to see another path forward. Couple things I wanted to ask about. One was just terminology. I think sometimes we want to have a conversation, but we're so worried about the terms. I know working in the space of working with immigrants and immigration advocacy and all that, or so many other spaces, but substance misuse, substance abuse, substance use. I hear you say substance use disorder. What are some of the terms? Does it matter? Please, actually, Dr. Jason.
Sure. It absolutely matters. So the way we frame something either opens or closes a conversation. I say substance use disorder. Some people just say substance use. The reason I add disorder is because you could use substances and it not be a disorder. Words that we don't use is addict. The exception to that is the old school people who use the term themselves and say, this helps me. Can you please refer to me this way? And then we respect their autonomy to say, that's what you're asking of me. I will honor and respect that. I would encourage us to include the word recovering in front of it so we can at least say recovering addict if you're going to have me walk down that road. So the language that we use absolutely matters. It also lends itself to the recovery process differently. So we don't want to over-identify ourselves as one specific thing. It shifts the lens from the totality of who we are as human beings. So someone might struggle at a point in time with a substance use disorder and also, have these other roles and characteristics. And when we kind of pigeonhole ourselves into I'm an addict or they're an addict, it takes away, to Dr. Reynolds' point, some of that self-efficacy of I'm recovering from a substance use disorder and all the other things that we're a part of. Maybe, and I'm a teacher and I'm a loving spouse and I'm all these other things combined. So it's kind of twofold. We want to be able to open take the blinders off and show that the perspective of who we are is larger than this one moment in time or this one piece of us, and also even that piece of us that we can frame it and word it in a way that removes the judgment and stigma and also opens up to the sense that recovery is part of that process as well.
So the stigma is the number one thing that keeps people out of treatment. And generally, folks don't have the greatest view of people who struggle with substance use disorder. So if I asked you all, and maybe I will, how many of you have some personal experience with a family member, loved one, someone you know who struggled with addiction? Raise your hand. Right, almost everybody. For how many of you was that a positive experience? Right, it's often not.
I mean, it was positive because the end result, 30 years later.
Yes.
It was recovered out.
But would you say it was a long road?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's in some ways how we form our opinions and beliefs about addiction. Outside of that, when do we learn about folks who are struggling with addiction? When they commit crimes, right? You open up the newspaper, somebody held up a 7-Eleven because they needed money for heroin, or you're the victim of a crime because somebody needed money for drugs. And if you look at the crimes, untreated substance use disorder accounts for a lot of the crime that happens in our community. So those are the ways that we get information about addiction, right? And then we wonder why there's a stigma and why there are some barriers. And for most people, it's a scary kind of thing, right? The notion of being out of control and engaging in a behavior that's causing you repetitive harm and the people around you repetitive harm is something that's pretty frightening. And so the more and that's one of the reasons why we affirmatively hire folks that identify as being in recovery, right? It sets the standard, it sets a new role model, it lets the world know that you can recover from this. And in fact, we talk a lot about the overdose and poisoning fatalities. I led with that in this discussion. We don't talk about the fact that there's more than 20 million Americans who are living in recovery. And so we hear about the fatalities. They're what gets the headlines. They get our attention because, quite frankly, people are dying. But we tend to ignore the success stories, and we don't highlight them enough, and we don't revel in them enough. And this is something that people can actually recover from. And the more we embolden and empower those folks to speak up and say, I'm part of this huge community, I think the more we reduce that stigma, and the more likely people are to disclose what they're struggling with and then to go into care.
Thank you. I actually want to open up for a moment, and Megan, you'll give me a time frame, as I'm not paying any attention. What does that mean? Okay, so I actually want to open up to the audience here, the group of folks here, for some questions. We're going to have folks write them down if you want to write and hand up, or if you want to just stand up and or just sit down and give your question. I can repeat it again for the yes, Nick. Oh, I'm sorry. We need a mic.
They're recording. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not because we won't be able to hear you. It's because of the recording.
So I know that GLP drugs have been a game changer for a lot of people when it comes to weight loss, and they're also saying that many people are on those drugs, using those medications, find that they're not shopping as much and other kind of compulsive behaviors are improving. Are there similar medications you're seeing with treating substance use disorders that are kind of just coming out or getting traction?
So I'll take a first crack and then invite you to join in. So the science on GLP-1s, I think, is actually pretty exciting. I've looked at a number of the studies, and yeah, people find that as they experience reduced cravings for food, the same goes for alcohol, the same goes for other substances, the same goes for shopping, gambling, anything along those lines. In the substance use disorder space, we do have medications that are not necessarily new. They've been around for a long time. Methadone being one of them for opioids, buprenorphine for opioids as well. And I think, and naltrexone is the third drug. I will say in some circles, right, not in the Northwell circles, I don't think, but in some circles, there's a bias against those drugs. And folks will say, well, you're just trading one drug for another. The reality is that Suboxone doesn't make you dead, heroin does. And, you know, when folks decry the use of medications, I always say that if we think that substance use disorders have a biological component, a spiritual and a psychological component, this is designed to deal with that biological component, the cravings that frequently result in people being incarcerated and doing game-changing kind of things. Getting somebody on medication to reduce those cravings gives you the opportunity to do some of the really, really vital work. Again, there's still a stigma. And if you look across the board, less than half the folks who are struggling with addiction actually wind up on these medications, which are the gold standard now for treating opioid use disorder. I will also say, and I don't want to get overtly political here, but more than 80% of folks on those medications are also on Medicaid. And threats to the Medicaid program scare the hell out of me when it comes to potentially losing ground and fighting the fentanyl crisis. And so the reality is fighting fentanyl doesn't stop at the border. It happens in communities. And we know that Medicaid coverage for folks that are struggling with a mental health condition or a substance use disorder, that Medicaid program is absolutely vital.
I think we do a lot of education on the differentiation, to your point, between a drug and a medication. Even in medical terms, we use them interchangeably. When we're talking outside of that space, especially in behavioral health, we make a huge distinction between a drug versus a medication, because we do get that question asked pretty regularly. To your point, the genetic piece of it, the neurobiological piece of it is so interesting. I think it's why understanding these processes as a disease also helps to remove a lot of the stigma, because there is a neurological component to it. The way that we see substance use play out is that it's impacting the pleasure center of our brain, where we're now seeking out that pleasure the same way a craving for sugar works. And then we get this boost of neurotransmitters that help us to feel good immediately, or to your point earlier, remove something unpleasant that we were previously experiencing, which is a reinforcement pattern. And when things are reinforced, as we all know, then we seek them out to have that reinforcement continue. It's the same pattern that we utilize in principle to change the pattern and the association, to make new patterns and association. And the medication helps with that genetic piece of it. And then behaviorally, therapy helps with the other piece of it. So that's why we talk about like people, places, and things a lot in recovery. If I walk into a place and my brain starts firing, you need that pleasure boost you need to use. There's a neurological reaction that happens when I'm around people that I use with, or when I'm around certain places. You know, these things become ingrained. And there's a lot of like brain scan studies that show this association of when you're triggered, that there's actually brain firing that's happening that leads to this increase in craving. So the more that we can do to combat that on both fronts, the more successful we can be. And also the easier chance that we have. You know, I always say life is so hard. Like if we have these ways we're not trying to avoid, and if we have these ways that just help us to move through it more fluently, in a healthy way, that's the goal. Instead of it being this catastrophe because I'm trying to muscle through something and then everything either explodes or implodes depending on the person. So that repetition forms new connections. And then at a certain point, it becomes, and it's not easier, it becomes more habitual. So the way I always think about it is with weightlifting. If you go to the gym all the time, a 5-pound weight is a 5-pound weight. In the beginning of exercising, if you lift a 5-pound weight every day, 5 pounds feels like 20 pounds. After you've done it for 3 months, 5 pounds feels like 0 pounds. The weight didn't change. You got stronger. So the more time that we that we pair these new associations, that we take healthy resources and utilize them to make improvements, we get stronger in what that looks like. And those become new patterns and new habits over time. And when we look at recovery, we're not looking at this, we're moving away from the same black and white thinking that we do in all behavioral health stances. We're not saying someone's either using or they're not. Whether it's harm recovery, harm reduction, or abstinence of a model, either way, we're not looking at it like that. We're looking at progress, which is duration, frequency, and intensity. So am I using things in a less life-threatening way? Is there more space between maybe my relapses? When I relapse, am I seeking recovery more quickly and rebounding differently? That's what progress looks like.
Thank you. Oops, I want to ask another question from the group. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to say I'd never seen this film before, but it was very profound to me because it seemed like this guy was a functional user. He had a history that was replete with major issues at school, and yet he slid through. And I wondered if, the racial component, he's obviously living in a pretty downtrodden way himself. That apartment looked like hell. And, we don't talk about the differentiation that much about status and neighborhoods and what happens, and maybe having a white teacher talk about dialectics and stuff like that was encouraging in some way. He slid through even with the head of his department for not following the syllabus and stuff. And I just thought it was good food for thought to have a film like this explain some stuff. And his influence over this girl was really pretty scary too. They saw that at the party where he's kind of grinding on her, and yet, he was back the next day. So I just wanted to say I like the film. Thanks for showing it.
Yeah, so, that resonated with me too. And I will say the pathway for substance use disorder looks very, very different depending upon who you are and how you're positioned in terms of what you're able to quote unquote get away with, right? Ultimately, something happens, but we run clinics in Hicksville and Hempstead, so they're outpatient treatment centers. And I will tell you, just the landscape in Hempstead looks a lot different, but it shifted over time. So I would say when the heroin crisis or the pill crisis really here in America, and more specifically on Long Island came, it was my white middle class folks, because who could afford the prescriptions, right? And so that's where it started. It then lodged in heroin because heroin was a much cheaper alternative, and there was iStop and the crackdown on prescription meds and overprescribing. And at that point, we began talking finally about criminal justice reform, and not necessarily simply sentencing users. We started to look at alternatives to incarceration, that kind of thing, because the folks who were being arrested, because there was no other choice, they were doing things that were bad enough to get them arrested, was predominantly white middle class kids whose parents had some resources. And so finally we had this rude awakening that a criminal justice solution to a public health problem was a non-starter. It didn't really work. And we started to see more alternatives to incarceration. We saw bail reform and that kind of thing. I worry now that the pendulum, I feel like it's starting to swing back. But look, I worked in North Bellport during the AIDS crisis on the first go around of heroin. Almost everyone who used heroin at that time was a person of color. And I stopped counting how many folks didn't necessarily die of overdoses, but wound up incarcerated. And that just doesn't happen during the second wave of heroin into fentanyl and that kind of thing. So, and not that I'm advocating for that approach, but it's clearly based on race and class. And so I hope that some of the lessons that we learned from the last go around of the heroin crisis remain in place as the population begins to shift back. I mentioned that the largest overdose increases are among people of color. And so it'll be interesting to see if some of those bright-minded reforms remain in place, or if we abandon them now that the populations are shifting.
I'd like to jump into that for a moment. I think before you were talking about the importance of conversation, I do want to bring up the fact that at least out here across the east end of Long Island, we've got more than 50% Latino student body. across 23 school districts, a significant number that's 50%. And that doesn't mean all of those folks are not speaking English or not, or undocumented or something like that. But it does mean that sort of the cultural nuances around conversation, around trust, around sort of our ideas, whatever, our backgrounds might be Polish, Italian, different backgrounds, you're raised in a household that often says, don't tell anyone your problems. Don't tell anyone that anything that happens in this household. And that is a real strong motivator for just shutting someone down, whether they're an adult or an adolescent, into not speaking, into having that level of shame and not being able to have a conversation. My question to you, because we do see this level of struggle that has no outlet, has no place of conversation. We have really dangerously low levels of bicultural and bilingual educators and people in the field to work with our youth and our adults and our families. I want to ask you, for each of you, how are you kind of dealing with that, combating it, celebrating it? What are you doing in your organizations?
I can start. So one of the gaps that you mentioned is bilingual clinicians. So I think there's a big mystery behind what you do in behavioral health in general. So Northwell has a huge push of education. Our goal is to help kind of lift the veil of what we do in behavioral health. We go into schools. We also are starting a school in Northwell that's a fast track to healthcare. And we're starting volunteer programs so that high school students could get associated with what it looks like to work in behavioral health or healthcare. There's also programming that we do in the city where students get into this internship program. It's a paid internship, and part of it is hands-on experience. I think I've gone there 3 years in a row to speak about what the field of psychology is. They have an international track and a New York City native track. So there are people that are there from other countries just for the education system that is part of that program. So, I think one thing that we're doing is just trying to get more people that have like a larger future capacity to have that impact, being able to really be exposed to what the various potentials are and just avenues into the field in general. I think another thing, going back to frame the conversation, is that piece of curiosity. Like, it's not our place to tell somebody or someone's family what is the right or best thing to do. Like, we need to fully understand. And when we talk through individuals' treatment as we meet as a treatment team and we talk through like what's going on, what's their background, what's the family situation, what do we think is the most effective plan for care. One, the family is part of that conversation. Two, the cultural component is part of that conversation. Like, we want to understand what is their sense of healthcare, what is their sense of behavioral health, what is their sense of recovery, therapy, because all of that plays into how we can help to kind of build that trust in the system. And we want to also frame it for healthcare providers because we see people in like a pocket of when they're in front of us. We want to understand the whole lens of the experience. So I'll give an example that came up recently. For one of the teachings I was doing, I was working with a resident, and he said, I don't know why this patient, it was an adolescent, won't tell me what's going on. The faster they open up to me, the faster I can get them discharged. And I said, walk me through how they ended up in front of you. And this very sweet young man goes, he showed up to a pediatric emergency center. He finally shared that he was suicidal. They brought him to an emergency department. Family and everyone says, tell them the truth. It's in your best interest. He tells them his truth, that he was thinking about ending his life. They remove all of his personal belongings. He no longer has a cell phone. We all know how teens feel about their cell phones. He's put into scrubs. He's put on an ambulance and shipped to us, where now he's on a unit in front of a resident who's saying, tell me what's going on. Why on earth would this child say what he's feeling and that he's having these types of thoughts? So the more that we can understand that whole experience, and that's just like, one example. Obviously, we're talking about different cultural experiences. If we have an adolescent in front of us or an adult who was raised in a family of either having negative experiences interacting with the healthcare system or being told, don't share, like, that's a lot of us just building trust, and those things have a trickle-down effect. I'm sure you've had this experience where we're talking to people in recovery and the group will ask, like, what was that moment in time? And generally it's there was maybe 15 conversations with healthcare professionals that were shut down, and the 16th resonated. And just the trust that was built from the first 15 lent themselves for the 16th to be an open dialogue.
And we always use that kind of mindset with our clinicians who get frustrated with consumers, and that sometimes it's that 16th conversation that makes a huge difference. You know, for us, we've always prioritized hiring folks that reflect the people we serve. That's not to say that that's easy, particularly in a very competitive job market. Lots of folks come work for us and then realize they can make more at Northwell and they leave. But I'm not bitter. You know, so among our staff, 79.9% are female. Our entire leadership team, with the exception of me, are female, and then 68% of our staff are people of color. And so I've always had the belief that if you can get help from a person who doesn't look exactly like you across from an exam room or in a therapy room, but sometimes helps if they do, just in terms of that understanding, the connection you're able to create. You know, in our sites, we have 5 sites in Hempstead, and I will say everyone that works in our programs there comes from that community. And so maybe your grandparents knew my grandparents. There's some connection that we can play on. Our folks know what's going on in the community. So when somebody says they're not using anymore, they could say, are you sure? Because here's what people are talking about. And you might be 100% right, but let me kind of tell you what kind of we hearing and seeing out in the community. And so I think that emphasis on diversity, although it is threatened right now, is not like this standalone thing. It's public health. Like, if you want to do good public health, that's how you do it. And so this notion that we can put that aside depending upon you know, who's in power for 4 years is a fantasy. As you know, we've been around for 140 years. We've been doing that for 140 years. I'm not about to change it now, even if they try to take some money away.
Thank you. We got 5 minutes? All right. I'm actually going to ask a question for each of you. And for a short time before I did the work at the retreat, I actually came out to the east end of Long Island from Brooklyn and did not know what I was doing. I had to get a job. And I ended up working as a recruiter in the pharmaceutical industry, as working with JDs and PhDs and kind of intellectual property. But the question that I would ask a lot of candidates that I was talking with gave me a lot of insight. And it was, and this I'm going to adjust the money because I know how things have changed. But I'm going to say, and also as a nonprofit now, you know, the multi-year grants are very important. Let's say you got a $25 million grant for 3 years. Maybe that's nothing. I'm hoping that's a significant number. But let's say you had that in a particular area and you know that you've got 3 years. What's one of the, talk me through that a little bit. Give me a little bit of a timeline of the best use of that. And if that number should be higher, tell us what the number actually should be. So I'll start with you, actually, Dr. Jason.
This is a really big question. You know, we're kind of constantly applying for grants. And I think the way that you're framing the question is really interesting, because the way that it sounds like is, what can we do for a 3-year period that has a large impact? And one of the things that we try and think about when we're thinking through a grant is, how do we make that sustainable after the 3 years, which are kind of two different challenges, because there's a lot there. I would say one of the pushes that has been just like a passion soapbox of mine is in the prevention space. We don't get reimbursement for behavioral health in prevention the same way we do in other medicine. So there's no PCP for behavioral health. They do that quick screening for anyone that's been there recently. I ask every time I bring my kids to the doctor's office, or for myself, if I was positive on this screening, where do you send these people? Because generally there's a regulation that says you need to ask about depression, anxiety, and substance use, and then no understanding of what you're supposed to do with that information, no training, no resources provided. So I think that, to me, and this is a very nondescript answer to your very specific question, so I apologize for that, it would be somewhere in the space of more global prevention of behavioral health, more as a whole in the community, which I know a lot of people in this room are very passionate and involved in kind of setting the stage for. And I think that that's really powerful work because of the challenge with the, you know, reimbursement model compared to other healthcare initiatives.
Thank you.
So it's easy. I have a wish list of grant applications we send out on a regular basis. I mentioned that we have 3 recovery centers by statute and by regulation and just good practice. They serve only adults. So if a 15-year-old shows up at the door of that center and says, "Look, I found a path to recovery. I just want to be with sober kids in a safe environment," I can't let them stay. Like, you can't hang here. And so where do they go? I know where they go. And so we ought to have at least 3 or 4 youth recovery centers across Long Island. And we ought to have more recovery centers for adults. I mentioned Westbury, Islandia, and Riverhead. Oh, what about Freeport? What about Huntington? What about all the other communities that house people in recovery who could use some assistance? We ought to have a lot more services for people who are coming out of jails and prisons. We don't do enough there. If anything, we re-traumatize them and then expect them to find that path to recovery when they get out. Should certainly stop. So in Suffolk, there's a thing called DASH. It's a crisis stabilization center, an equivalent, and they would shudder at this description, but it's almost like a walk-in for psychiatric conditions as opposed to going to the EDs. EDs are nice places, but they aren't necessarily equipped to deal with all the things that people are struggling with. Why is there only one for all of Long Island? Why is there only one recovery school for kids who are struggling? There are 10,000 kids a year who leave Long Island to go to treatment, usually in other states. They all come home. The reoccurrence rate is about 97%. Why? Because we throw them right back into the same toxic environment. It's like taking a fish out of a polluted pond, letting it catch its breath, and then throwing it back in and say, "Why are you sick again?" And so why don't we have more recovery schools here on Long Island? The list could go. You want me to keep going? There are so many gaps in the system and so many things that we should be doing. I feel like there's a lot of work to be done. But I think the other part of it is not only addressing behavioral health as a diagnosable condition. And look, there are emerging areas that we should be focusing on, but how do we get back to some of the basics? How do we reduce income inequality? How do we address the healthcare disparities that persist in every area of medicine? How do we make addiction similar to other medical disciplines and stop treating it as a stepchild? What are we going to do about the huge number of young people who are engaged in sports betting? The state is making $2 billion a year on online sports betting. Kids are gambling on their phones. Lots of them are developing problems. There's 2 problem gambling recovery centers on Long Island. We run both of them, but there's only 2. So when are we going to begin to deal with some of these things? If I had $5 million, I would go to New York State and say, how come we haven't run a public education campaign around the legalization of cannabis? Plenty of people are making lots and lots of money. And because it's now legal, kids believe it's safe. We should counter some of the messages around cannabis and talk about how the fact that it's not safe if your brain is still developing, it's not safe if you're pregnant, it's not safe if you're driving a car, and it's not safe if you're using that because it's easier to get weed than it is a psychiatric appointment. And so I got a whole list of things that I think we should be doing.
Well, I love that.
But it's longer
Thank
than
you.
3 years.
Okay, longer than 3 years. Yes, well, I'll make sure that we get it for longer. In the meanwhile, we definitely have some materials there. I think you can find the work that's happening in these 2 organizations online and reach out. I'm really excited about the work I'm excited about the space in Riverhead as well for Northwell. I'm excited to learn more about what's happening in Riverhead as well, and just stay more connected with Jeffrey, who I've known since I was at the retreat 2010, I think. So I really wonderful to get to speak with you both. Thank you for all being here. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Education Committee, and Sag Harbor Cinema. Yeah, thank you.